My name is Sean McGeever, and I'm a Young Life leader at Pinnacle High School, and I'm also on Young Life staff here in Phoenix, Arizona. And some of you probably know, but I am going through the Gospel of John because we talk about Jesus in Young Life Talks, and our club is going through the Gospel of John, the even chapters this semester. So we are now on chapter 9. So I'm going to give a couple thoughts about how to go through John chapter 9 for Young Life, Wildlife Talks, anything like that. But as always, definitely don't take my word for it. Look at the text yourself, talk to your area director, senior leader, talk to your pastor. Probably the more input you can get, the better, but certainly just start with the text itself. But here's a couple thoughts about this passage. This is a great chapter to tell a good club talk out of. In fact, last time, John 7, it's kind of a challenging one. Probably not a lot of natural, normal Young Life talks out of that one, but this one is a classic person of Christ talk that we would do in Young Life because it tells us a lot about who Jesus is and a little bit about who we are too. So this is, in John chapter 9, it's the story of Jesus healing the man that is born blind. In fact, the whole chapter basically captures this story. So you really could go through the whole chapter if you wanted to. It might end up being a little bit long. It's 41 verses, might take a decent amount to explain. I probably would not go through the whole thing. I would definitely go through verses 1 through 12 pretty carefully. And then I might pick and choose a little bit up to verse 34 what I do. I might save verses 35 through 41, possibly more for campaigners. I might just stay kind of focused, at least for a club talk, on the beginning of it, just Jesus's initial engagement with a man born blind. But there's a little bit about the structure. I'm going to give you a couple ideas about some main points that you could go through. First off, there's a fantastic phrase in here because the first people that come up, it's actually the disciples. They see the man that's born blind and they say, you know, is this man blind because of his parents or because of him? And Jesus's response is incredible. He says neither, first off, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But if you wanted a main point, here's a great point, which is this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And I would just turn that around and say, you know, there's all sorts of things going on in your life. Maybe even while you're here tonight at club, this has happened so that the work of God might be displayed in your life. And there's a million different ways that you could connect that. What they're going through right now, a difficult thing that they've gone through in the past, challenges that they're facing, maybe ahead with family, the school year, college, job, whatever. This is happening so that the power of God might be displayed in your life. I mean, Jesus just brings it home for all sorts of different situations there. So that would certainly be a main point that you could do a lot with. Second option is Jesus says that he is the light of the world. That is in verse 5. And so making a lot of that Jesus describes himself as the light of the world is definitely a home run. That's another solid person of Christ truth we want them to know. Now, I'll give you some ideas about how to bring that to life, but that is absolutely, if you say, guys, if there's one thing I want you to know, Jesus is the light of the world. You've done a good job. Why? Because that's the way that Jesus describes himself. And that's good enough for me. Here's another one, maybe a little bit of a kind of an odd topic, but a main point, and I'm going to use a kind of an odd word, but say, you know, life is not about karma. I think throwing out the karma word would certainly get some people to raise an eyebrow. It's not something you expect to hear a lot when people are talking about the Bible or God. You say, you know, our life is not about karma. It's about what Jesus wants to do in your life. And I think this idea of karma might be a huge hook because that is basically what the disciples and the Pharisees are thinking that his blindness is connected to. It's because he did bad things. Apparently, there was some sort of Jewish theme here where the disciples who were Jewish and the Pharisees who were Jewish connected like ailments like blindness and things like that with being a sinner, either you or your parents. And so, we today don't have a lot of parallels with that except for karma. You know, you kind of get what's coming to you. You do something bad right now, might not, do anything bad for you now, but it'll come to you eventually. And the Bible is clearly against that in a kind of superstitious way. So a main point might be that life is not about karma. It's about the things that God wants to do in your life. I'll come back a little bit to clarify a point on that karma bit. But two, or actually, here's the next section, the third section. What this passage shows us about Jesus. First off, Jesus is the light of the world. Let's let Jesus speak for himself. And if that doesn't sound very impressive, that's okay. That's just the way Jesus explains himself. And we'll just trust that the Holy Spirit will drive that home. Now, we'll try to come around that, try to bring it to life. But that is a main point that we want everyone to know about Jesus. Another thing is that he healed a blind man. This is probably the most quintessential, basic aspect of a person of Christ talk. We want people to know what Jesus is like. We don't want them to know about his humanity. We want them to know about his divinity. Well, we know he's divine because he healed a man who was born blind. And so that's just a classic point that we can make about Jesus and that we shouldn't overlook and not skip over. Another one, this one might be a little less obvious, but throughout this story, the disciples accuse the man being born blind of sin. The Pharisees accuse the man that is born blind of being a sinner. And they also end up saying that Jesus is a sinner. Wait, hold on. Did I get that wrong there? Well, anyway, here's the thing. I'll have to clarify that. But the only person in there that doesn't accuse someone of being a sinner is Jesus. The only one that's basically not throwing the "you're a sinner" stone because of all the terrible things you do is Jesus. What Jesus responds with is healing. And there are times when Jesus definitely talks about sin, and we're going to come to those. But in this story, there is a marked difference between the people who are just kind of watching someone who has some problem in life, and their solution is, oh, I bet he deserves it because he's a sinner. He kind of gets what he's coming to him. Jesus says, no, that's not the way it works. So what does this show us about Jesus? Well, Jesus is not there throwing stones because of the way that things seem to be, and he's not labeling. Well, the reason why that is because of sin in kind of a superstitious way. What does this have to do with our life? Well, one thing that's really interesting is that the man who is blind, when he's told what to do, he just does it. So what does this have to do with our life? Well, this man simply did what Jesus asked him to do and told him to do. And for our lives, maybe we should consider a response similar to the man that's born blind. Now, he's not healed just in his interaction with Jesus. He's healed because of Jesus' promise, and then because of doing what Jesus said. Then he's healed. So what does that have to do with our life? Maybe we hear the things about what God tells us about life, and then we should act upon them and see what God does in our life upon that. Secondly, the man, what does this tell us about us? The man simply just told people what Jesus did. So what does this have to do with our life? We do not need to be some sort of explainers of the exact ways that God works. We don't have to have it all figured out, the way that Jesus heals, the claims that Jesus had. We can dig into all that. But the simple truth is the man just said, look, this is what God has done in our lives, in my life. And I think that shows us that Jesus allows a simplicity, especially when we're first stepping into a relationship with him, where we don't have to have it all figured out. Jesus will take us as we are when we just say, sure, I'll go wash in the pool of Siloam. I'll go ahead and do that. Yes, Jesus. That's how a relationship with Christ starts. There's also something in there that's really interesting, which is that the people, when they encounter the blind man who's now healed, they don't recognize him. So what does this tell us about our life? There might be something to be said that people might not recognize you in the same way after Christ has touched your life. You know, they come up and they say, is this the man that was born blind? I think it is. I'm not really sure. Well, when Jesus comes into your life, it might be that people don't recognize you as the same person. And that maybe, could explain a lot of things if you've changed recently because of Christ coming into your life. But it also, might be a little bit interesting. People might scratch their heads and go, what is it about you? And this sort of change is it does happen when when Jesus comes into people's lives. And another thing, what does this have to do with our lives? It's kind of the converse of what I said before, which is that bad events are not tied to bad choices in a way that's kind of superstitious, in a karma way. We're not born with some sort of setback because of our sin or our parents' sin necessarily. Now, there are consequences to things. There are definitely consequences to actions, but there's not a direct correlation with sinning and with some sort of, like spiritual or life setback. This man was not born blind because he or his parents were sinners. He was born blind because it was an opportunity for the power of God to work in his life. Okay, here are a couple relevant details. One, it talks about Jesus being a rabbi. Well, Jesus is a rabbi because he's a respected teacher. And it's actually pretty interesting because he wouldn't have been formally trained as a rabbi, and yet they recognize him as a rabbi. But when you're doing a club talk, you can just insert the word teacher in there, and that's a good synonym for that. Another one is that the blind man later, I think it's in verse 17, he describes Jesus as a prophet, which might kind of strike you as interesting because Jesus doesn't necessarily like predict a lot of future. Maybe he says when you go and wash in the pool, you'll be able to see. But one of the things that you need to know, if you don't know already, is in the Old Testament that prophets weren't known just because of the words that they are given to speak on behalf of God, but they're also known throughout a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament because of the miracles they could do. Especially look at Elijah or Elisha. There's all sorts of miracles that they did. So when Jesus was doing a miracle, he was definitely in the category of prophet, not just because of his words, but also because of his miraculous actions. So when it's there, if you include that in your talk, this man must be a prophet. Man must be the sort of person that can do miracles. That's how I might just kind of smooth that out. The last one is that the Pharisees describe themselves as disciples of Moses. And what you would need to know about that is that they are clearly saying that they recognize themselves as experts in the law. Moses would have been the one that delivered the Ten Commandments and then delivered the law to Israel. And so Moses and the law are basically synonyms. So when they say that they're disciples of Moses, they're emphasizing their connection with all of the laws in the Old Testament. In fact, the Pharisees are known for knowing all 613 laws which were in the Old Testament and striving to keep all of them perfectly and being pretty exact about all that. So when they say they're disciples of Moses, they are certainly taking that to the extreme, saying we are disciples of every single law in the Old Testament. We take them extremely serious and we judge ourselves by how much we keep them. So that's what they mean by that. So you might be able to just say, to paraphrase it, to this they were, in verse 28, it says, we are disciples of Moses. We are people who keep every single law in the Bible. That's what we're about. Something like that. All right, I'll just move on to the illustrations and then basically I'll be done. I think the best illustrations come when you just pick out things that are in the text. Like if you were to be the set designer or if you're going to run a play, what sort of things would you need to go run out to the store and buy? And here are a couple. The most obvious thing that you could use there, which would get people's attention, would be spit and mud. Getting some dirt, getting maybe a big glass of water, kind of swishing it around, spitting it in there, getting it on a piece of, maybe a plate or something, stirring it up. If you do that, you will have everyone's attention. And it's certainly a great opportunity to say, God takes things that are bizarre like this mud that's full of spit and dirt, and he can do miracles with it. And, God can do incredible miracles like here we are doing skits, games, all kinds of wild things. But you know what? There's something really incredible about this, which is we're talking about the living God right now, or all sorts of things. You could just use the spit and mud, talk about how Jesus can work in strange ways. You could even, it might be a good opportunity if you wanted to tie that in with an introduction story. So you could talk about a way that God has worked in your life in a very surprising way, kind of a spit and mud miracle. So maybe the second possible illustration would be to emphasize the blindness and taking people into the world of a man who's born blind. I think there's two ways you can do that. One, literally you could blindfold either yourself, or you could pull someone up from the crowd and blindfold them for part of your talk, even interview them, ask them what it's like to be in the dark and to not know what's going on, what life is like, all sorts of things with maybe a blindfold, but perhaps better, and tying into where Jesus says that he's the light of the world, because those are certainly, I mean, they're right there. Jesus is with a blind guy, and the first thing that the way he describes himself is, he says, I'm the light of the world. They're certainly there on purpose together to contrast darkness and light. Goes back to John's prologue in John 1:4. But you could emphasize or illustrate the blindness by turning off the lights. It's a classic illustration, but it's a great thing to do. And then talk about what it's like to live life in the dark and to not have the full picture about life and about God and about Jesus. Maybe all sorts of superstitions and misunderstandings like karma, and Jesus is here to just point out you're a sinner, you're a sinner. The story, basically sheds light on that, which is Jesus is not about karma. Life doesn't work that way, and Jesus isn't here to say you're a sinner, you're a sinner. He's here to bring light into your life and into your world, and to use surprising things like spit and mud and life. He wants to bring life through light, and you turn on the lights or you use a flashlight and you say, look, Jesus wants to bring life and light into your life where it's never been before. So there's a couple ideas about ways to walk through John 9. It's a great club talk and kind of a fun one. I want to say easy one, but there's just so many different directions you can go through. And just even as a point, especially for campaigners, you could really dig into that initial question that this happens so that the power of God might be displayed in your life. I mean, you could have a lot of conversations, especially leaders, junior leaders, talking about the way that God has worked through bizarre circumstances and difficult circumstances to show how God is powerful and real, and that Jesus is alive and he's the light and life of the world. So I'll just give it another moment there. If anyone has any comments, thoughts, ideas of your own, but otherwise I'll just kind of wrap it up. Best advice for first-time talk givers. That's such a good question. That is a great question. Here's what I would say. First off, start really early. Don't wait until a few days before. I would, even to this day, you can see here, I would print out. I've done this talk at club and at camps more times than I can think of, and yet still I printed it out word for word. I went through it, I circled, I wrote questions. I just really dug into the text, so I would print it out and not be shy about really just, just eat it up and tear it up with all sorts of analysis and questions. I would start with the text is the number one thing I would say. We're really tempted to want to build a club talk around a story. Don't do that. Don't do that. Build a club talk around the scripture. God will give you the story. And it's okay if maybe your intro story, your personal story is not so good. If you want them to remember something, you want the truths about Jesus to be the thing that they remember. So anyway, start with this text. Start early, I would say 2 weeks. Print it out. Write a lot of questions, underline things, ask God to give you maybe a main point that you want to build off of. Then I have some different handouts and things like that, how to structure it. But then I would meet with someone who's done club talks for a couple of years, a week ahead of time, and show them what you have and ask for some feedback. Then once you get a plan, I would say just be confident. I would drive around in my car and try to say the talk while I was driving, or I would go and lock myself in a room where no one could hear me and I'd practice it. Those are things I would do. But I would say if it's a first-time club talk, just go for it and enjoy it. If you're nervous, that's a sign that Satan probably really doesn't want you to feel comfortable. I'd say the more nervous you are, probably the more confirmation you should have that you're doing something that's really important for the kingdom and for your own step of faith. And I have another thing just about your heart and experience with it is when you're done with it, just know that you're going to hear a discouraging thought. And I would say totally discard that, completely ignore discouraging, I messed this up, I forgot to say this. those are all just lies and attacks from the enemy. God is so pleased that you stepped out as a child to talk about him. But you might want to ask an experienced leader in the crowd, say, hey, if you give me, one encouragement, word of encouragement and one thing to work on, tell them that beforehand, and I bet an experienced leader would love to do that. But hopefully, does that help? I hope it does a little bit. I'd say just have fun with it. If the people in the crowd will love it that you're giving your first club talk. So I hope that helps a little bit. Yeah, great. I'm glad that helps. That really helps. Some of the best club talks I've seen have been from people who are doing the first or second club talk. I don't know what it is, but I've seen some great club talks. And if you are having your first one soon, I wouldn't be surprised if it's really great. All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks for the questions. That's fun. And let's see, leader from Houston, thanks for doing these. Always great and fun to hear more ideas. Yeah, and thank you for the encouragement. I never really know who listens to these or that, but that's an awesome word of encouragement. I think it'd be awesome if a bunch of us were sharing ideas like this and collaborating just to learn more about Scripture and how to communicate the gospel in lots of different ways to kids that we love and to ourselves too. So anyway, I'm going to tune out here, but I'll post all this. I need to type this up, but I appreciate you guys being here. Thanks. Bye.